Tonight, let us wander into the gentle hush of an older world. A world where evening came not with the flip of a switch, but with the slow, deliberate lighting of a flame. A world where shadows deepened, not with fear, but with familiarity. Before the hum of machines, before the warm glow of bulbs behind frosted glass, there was another kind of light. Flickering, imperfect, a live dot. It was the light of candles, beeswax, and tallow, soot and silence. This is a story not of great events, but of quiet evenings. A story of hands, of hearts, and of the gentle rhythm of life lived before electricity. Settle in. Let us walk softly together. By Candlelight. Chapter 1. The Candle's Birth. Before candles ever lit the bedside tables of weary villagers or the ink-smeared desks of scholars, they began as craft humble, repetitive, and faintly sweet-smelling. The world, even in its grandest cities, once relied on fire in its rawest forms. The snapping hearth, the oil lamp, the rushlight. Long before modern comforts, the coming of night was not a gentle thing. Darkness arrived as a solid presence. It slipped between the beams of a cottage, pooled in corners, and crept across the fields like a tide. To meet this quiet but consuming presence, people turned to flame. First to torches and open fires. Then gradually to candles, those small, self-contained suns. The earliest candles were far from delicate. In ancient Rome, tallow was poured into molds or hardened in rough rolled dips. In China, they used whale fat. In India, wax was rendered from boiling cinnamon bark, releasing not just light, but a pleasant scent. Wherever there were people and night, there was the need for something small and flickering to hold it back. But it was in medieval Europe that candle-making settled into familiar form. There, the chandler, the candle maker, held a quiet but essential place in the village. Often working from a side room or workshop, the chandler prepared his materials with slow dedication. Tallow from sheep or cattle was melted and grate blackened. Pots, its odor strong, its texture waxy. Beeswax, more expensive, offered a cleaner, sweeter burn and was often reserved for churches, guild halls, or wealthier homes. Candle making was patient work. First came the wick-braided cotton or linen, soaked in brine and dried on wooden racks. Then came the dipping. A line of wicks was strung across a rod, balanced between two hooks. The chandler would dip the row into a vat of hot wax, lift them out, and wait. Then again and again. Each layer cooled and thickened the taper. Over time, the candle grew like a tree, forming rings. This process could take hours, even days, and was governed more by feel than by measurement. Children sometimes helped, especially in colder months when the smell of warm wax filled the home. They would watch, wide-eyed, as the candles thickened into something usable. Bees buzzed outside, oblivious to the gentle theft of their labor. There was always a murmur in these rooms, a rustle of aprons, the clink of metal ladles, the faint hiss of wax as it cooled. The result was never perfect. Each candle curved slightly, bent by a stray draft or a shift in the pot, but no one minded. These were tools, not decorations. There were other ways to light a home, of course. Rushlight strips of dried rush plant dipped in fat were common in poorer cottages. They burned quickly and with a bit of smoke, but they could be made at home. Oil lamps, carved from clay or later made of metal, offered longer-lasting light, but required olive oil or other costly substances. Candles, however, held a special status. They were simple, portable, and offered something the others didn't. A flame that could be carried from one room to another, shared from one person to the next, passed hand to hand like a whisper. They were the first light to greet the evening, and the last to surrender to sleep. Churches needed candles in enormous numbers. Monks and lay brothers would spend long days preparing them for services. In the great, echoing naves of monasteries, Where shadows clung to arches and pews, candlelight became something more than practical. It became sacred. A flickering halo to illuminate chants and scripture. But beyond the chapel and cloister, candles had a different life. They lit the corners of modest cottages, marked the hours for tradesmen in workshops, guided midwives and watchmen through unlit streets. They were tucked into sconces, perched on holders of wood or iron, and carried on little brass trays dotted night. A single candle might sit on a table, drawing the entire household into its circle. People gathered close not out of sentiment, but necessity. Light was precious. The further one sat from the flame, the less one could see. In winter, it was not unusual for candles to be rationed, especially among the poor. A single candle might be allowed for an evening's use, to be carefully lit after dusk and extinguished at bedtime. And yet, in this limitation, there was a kind of closeness. Families learned to work and rest together, each activity shaped by the simple question, how much light do we have left? Even the flame itself had moods. A clean-burning beeswax candle would dance steadily, casting a golden circle with soft edges. A cheaper tallow candle sputtered and smoked, casting long, shifting shadows. There were tricks to help a candle last longer, trimming the wick, shielding it from drafts. Rotating its base stopped the arrival of the match, and the 19th century changed how candles were used, but not their role. Long before that, however, fire had to be borrowed from hearth or neighbor. Flint and steel were slow and unreliable. So, a candle once lit might remain lit all night, if possible. From it, others were kindled. It became the flame at the center of the evening's rhythm. There were candle clocks, 2 cylinders marked at intervals, each line burning down in a predictable number of minutes. A quiet hourglass of wax and wick. They weren't precise, but they were enough for small needs. An hour of reading. A prayer before sleep. The history of the candle is not one of grand inventions, but of modest persistence. It was shaped by necessity, softened by habit, and held in millions of hands over centuries. Though it offered only a flicker against the dark, it carried with it the comfort of ritual, the intimacy of proximity, and the warmth of something small, steady and human. And so, as night fell in centuries past, the world did not grow quiet, all at once. Instead, there was the slow ceremony of preparation. A candle trimmed, a wick lit, a breath held. The birth of a flame, once again, in a world that never truly stopped needing it. Chapter 2. Evening in the cottage evening came gradually in the countryside. It wasn't marked by a flicker of electric light or the low hum of a lamp springing to life. It arrived in small, familiar ways. The air cooled. The outlines of distant trees softened. The shadows inside deepened their reach, like cats stretching across a wooden floor. The world slipped into dusk, as if exhaling after a long day. In a small cottage nestled near the edge of a field, be it in 18th century Dorset or along the banks of a quiet French river, the close of day brought with it a rhythm. It was slow, habitual, almost meditative. There was no rush. There rarely was. A child might be the first to notice the darkness. "Shall I light it now?" they'd ask, fingers already on the match tin, or the long splinter of kindling laid beside the hearth. But often, it wasn't quite time yet. Parent might glance at the small clock above the mantel wound by hand that morning and shake their head. "Let the light stretch a little further," they'd say. "We've not used the last of the day." But eventually, inevitably, the light would be lit. The first candle was always the most significant. It was often the best candle, the cleanest beeswax, saved from Sunday or the previous evening. It stood in a holder at the center of the table or beside the fireplace. When it caught flame, the room breathed in with it. One didn't light all the candles at once. Not unless there was illness or sewing to be done by older eyes. One was enough, and from it, the rest would follow only as needed. It might be tipped gently to light the rushlight by the chair, or the lantern hanging by the door. But the central flame was never wasted. It was shared and carried with care. The candlelight changed the room. What had been a space of broad daylight softened into corners and edges. Wood grain glowed faintly. The brass pot on the shelf caught just a touch of warmth. Shadows danced lightly on the walls, not in menace, but in company. It was not the cold dark of isolation, but the comforting dark of enclosure. A fire was almost always going, even in the milder months. Its heat was modest, often more smoke than flame, but it added to the sense of presence. A stew might simmer there, or a kettle rest above glowing coals, waiting to be poured. The fire's light, unlike the candles, was louder, more alive. Together, they gave the cottage its pulse. Children would settle in low chairs, sometimes on woven rugs or a folded blanket near the hearth. They'd speak softly or hum, or busy themselves with a small toy. Older children might begin to mend something under instruction socks, a loose button, or a corner of fabric that had torn in the garden. Their work would pause often, not out of boredom, but to admire the play of light against the thread. Meals were not rushed. By candlelight, there was no urgency. Plates were simple, often carved wood or earthenware. Bread was thick and uneven. Soup or broth came in wide bowls, and everything was eaten slowly, methodically. The flame gave food a different presence. The surface of broth glimmered faintly. Butter looked golden and alive. There was something deeply satisfying about this. Quiet abundance, nothing lavish, but everything sufficient. After supper, the family might sit close together. Sometimes a story was told. Not read, unless there happened to be a literate number and a well-worn book. More often, stories were remembered handed down orally. Tales of a relative's mischief, a storm years ago, or the old mill and its vanished owner. These were stories not meant to thrill, but to comfort. They connected one evening to the next. One might imagine that in such households, silence was heavy. But that wasn't quite true. The rooms weren't silent, they were simply hushed. The sounds were soft and recurring. The scrape of a spoon, the sigh of the fire, the faint pop of resin in the logs. Conversation was low and unhurried. People spoke because it was natural to share the moment, not to fill a void. Some evenings included small tasks. A mother might sit with a basket of darning, holding fabric near the candle to thread her needle. A father might trim the wick or adjust the fire. In wealthier homes, the servants would perform these tasks, but in the cottage, the family shared them. Lighting was precious and used carefully always, with awareness. Sometimes, a candle needed replacing. The old one had burned low, its base a misshapen puddle. A child might be sent to fetch a new taper from the storage box in the pantry. Wooden chest with bits of wax clinging to its edges. The act of choosing a candle was itself a small ceremony. Not too thin, not too crooked. A candle that would last the evening. Outdoors, the world was changing too. Through the small window's panes imperfect and slightly warped, one could see the shapes of trees losing their detail. Crows might pass in silhouette. The lane would empty of sound, and the distant hills would disappear into dark folds. The candlelight inside became not just illumination, but insulation. A barrier against the world beyond. In winter, the contrast was starker. Snow reflected any remaining daylight, but once night arrived, it consumed everything. Candles would be used more liberally in these months, though still with care. Oil lamps were sometimes lit as well, especially for reading or writing, but the candle remained central. It was more than light, it was companionship. Some homes have little rituals tied to candle use. A pinch of salt dropped on the flame too. ward off bad dreams. A match lit with a whispered wish. A candle left in the window if someone was expected home late. These habits were passed quietly between generations, accepted without question. In this world, fear of the dark was not what it is now. Darkness was normal. It was part of the day. It had rhythm and routine. People navigated their cottages by memory and muscle. Where the stool was placed, how many steps from chair to shelf. The candle was used for what was necessary, not to erase the dark, but to partner with it. On occasion, a guest might arrive, a neighbor delivering something, or passing through. The door would open, letting in a gust of colder air and the sound of crunching gravel or wet shoes. Candles were moved slightly, offered to guide them in. Hospitality was always extended with warmth, and the flame made this easier. A shared drink, a bit of bread, perhaps a place to sit. Then, with thanks, the visitor would depart into the dark once more, carrying a lantern or small candle in hand. In wealthier households, there might have been more candles placed in wall sconces, candelabras, or ornate holders. The rooms were larger, ceilings higher, and light needed to be distributed. But in the cottage, a single flame had reach. It was close enough to reflect in every eye, to warm every gesture. And when more light was needed, the solution wasn't always to add candles. It was to move closer together. As bedtime approached, the cottage shifted again. The main candle would be trimmed or snuffed. A smaller one might be lit to carry up to the sleeping loft. It was placed in a shallow tin dish with a handle, practical, designed not to drip. Children often went to bed first. They climbed narrow stairs or ladders with quiet familiarity, casting long shadows as they went. The candle's light followed them only part of the way. It wasn't needed to reach the bed. They undressed by feel, folded clothes by touch, and slipped beneath thick covers worn smooth by years of use. Downstairs, the remaining adults might sit a moment longer. There was no television, no radio, no pressing obligation. Just the small golden circle of the candle, and the slow drifting thoughts that come at the end of a day lived close to the land. Finally, the candle was extinguished. Some used a metal snuffer, bell-shaped and efficient. Others simply breathed it out. The room blinked, and the dark returned not with menace, but with finality. Outside, the stars continued overhead. Inside, all was still. The last heat of the fire hissed in the grate, and in the ashes, the scent of wax lingered, a small echo of the evening that had just passed. It was life, paced by light. A light that did not flood, but flickered. A life not hurried, but held gently. And in that cottage, now resting under roof and sky, sleep came as it always had, slowly, steadily, by candlelight. Chapter 3. Time by Flame. In a world without electric clocks or digital alerts, time was experienced differently. It wasn't kept so much as it was felt, measured not by seconds ticking away on a screen, but by the slow, patient burn of a candle's wick. In the days before electricity, light and time were deeply intertwined, each shaping the rhythm of the other. Candles, though humble, became tools of timekeeping. Their steady consumption of wax, their predictable descent, offered a kind of silent clock, one that burned down rather than counted up. It wasn't a perfect science, but it was close enough for most needs. A candle would last a known span, and from this, an evening could be measured. A large, thick candle might mark the duration of a feast, its slow burn mirroring the unhurried enjoyment of the meal and conversation. Smaller, thinner candles were better suited for shorter tasks. Their quick consumption, a reminder of the fleeting nature of the activity at hand. Some candles were crafted specifically for timekeeping. Candle clocks, as they came to be known, were made with careful precision. A long taper, typically of beeswax for its clean burn, was marked at even intervals along its length. Each notch represented a portion of time, often 30 minutes, sometimes an hour. As the candle burned, the level of melted wax crept downward and each line melted into nothing. The wax itself became a visual representation of time's passage, a tangible reminder of moments slipping away. The scent of the burning beeswax, subtle and sweet, added another layer to the sensory experience of time. In monasteries, these candles regulated prayer. The monastic day, divided into canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, and the rest, depended on regular intervals. Candles were lit to signal the passage from one devotion to the next. A monk, hearing the soft chime of a bell and seeing the wax reach its next mark, would rise from quiet study or rest and join his brothers in chant. The flickering light of the candle illuminated the sacred texts, casting dancing shadows on the walls and creating an atmosphere of solemn contemplation. The consistent rhythm of the candle's burn helped to instill a sense of order and discipline within the monastic community. In homes, too, the candle clock played its role. A housewife might light a marked candle to time a batch of bread rising. The warmth of the candle might even be used to help the dough rise, placing the candle and the dough in close proximity. A father might use it to allow an hour of reading or writing before bed, the soft glow providing a sanctuary of light in the encroaching darkness. The flame, always gentle, never startled. Its passage through time was more suggestion than command, a subtle guide rather than a demanding taskmaster. Yet most people did not live by candle clocks. Time was read from nature and habit. The position of the sun, the length of a shadow, the cry of birds at dawn. Farmers knew when to plant and harvest, based on the changing seasons, their lives dictated by the natural rhythms of the earth. But when the sun dipped low and the world grew indistinct, the candle took over. It didn't offer precision, but presence. You knew, for instance, that after lighting the evening candle, you had roughly 3 hours until bed. And that was enough. It was a shared understanding, a communal agreement to surrender to the night. In some places, candles were augmented with other timekeeping aids. A thin nail might be pressed into the wax at one of the intervals. As the candle melted down and reached the nail, it would fall with a faint clink onto a metal plate below, alerting the listener that a certain period had passed. These little devices served scholars and clergy, well, offering a way to know when to stop or begin or pause. The sound of the nail falling was a discreet signal, a gentle nudge back to the task at hand. But even without such devices, the flame itself told stories of time. Its behavior revealed the passage of moments. A bright, steady flame meant calm air, a settled room. A flickering one spoke of an open door or a draft sneaking through the shutters. Perhaps a visitor had arrived, bringing with them a gust of wind and a flurry of news. If the wick curled too far, the candle would gutter and wax would spill, wasting precious minutes of usable light. This was a cause for concern, a sign that the candle needed tending, or that the environment was not conducive to its proper burn. In wealthier homes, multiple candles extended the illusion of timelessness. Rooms stayed bright deep into the night, filled with conversation, music, and games. But even there, servants were tasked with trimming wicks and replacing spent candles before the room grew too dim. No one escaped the need to tend the flame. It was as close to maintenance of time as anyone had. A constant attention required to keep the candles burning was a subtle reminder of the effort required to maintain order and control in a world without modern conveniences. Candles, unlike clocks, offered no reminder. They didn't chime. They didn't strike the hour. They simply receded quietly until only a stub and a puddle remained. And with that, an evening passed. The silence of the candle's demise was a stark contrast to the insistent ticking of a clock, a quiet reminder of the ephemeral nature of time. The psychology of time under candlelight was different too. With electricity, light can be summoned in an instant. Rooms spring to life. Night becomes optional. But with a candle, the decision to light it was deliberate. You chose to begin the evening. You chose to end it. And in that space between, you lived with awareness of time passing not anxiously, but attentively. The act of lighting a candle was a conscious decision to embrace the present moment, to create a space for reflection and connection. Tasks were planned around available light. Letters were written early, when the wax was full and the light was strong. Sewing was done near the flame in those first bright hours, allowing for intricate stitches and detailed work. Reading was short and careful eyes tiring more quickly. The print harder to follow. And when the candle burned low, you did not replace it without thought. You asked yourself, is this moment worth another? Was the task at hand truly necessary, or could it wait until the light of day? There were customs tied to this awareness. Burning the candle at both ends, the phrase we still use, referred quite literally to waste. Lighting both ends of a candle gave more light, but halved its lifespan. It was something done only in urgency, by scholars cramming through the night, or servants finishing a late task. It was frowned upon, seen as reckless, a sign of disrespect for the precious resource of light and time. And so, most people respected the candle as both light and clock. When the flame bent lower, when the room grew dim, the day was allowed to end. People did not fight the dark, they met it. They let it in slowly, and they went to bed not with resistance, but with quiet surrender. The gradual dimming of the light prepared the mind and body for sleep, creating a sense of peace and tranquility. There was a beauty in this. Children learned to feel time in the way shadows moved across the wall, their imaginations fueled by the dancing shapes and flickering light. Women adjusted their routines to the length of the wick, their days structured by the availability of light. Men paused their work as the light waned, folding papers or setting down tools, saying simply, "That's enough for tonight." It was a moment of acceptance, a recognition of the limits of one's energy and the importance of rest. Travelers, too, carried time in their lanterns. A candle within a horn-enclosed lamp would guide them a certain distance. The flicker ahead was not just for sight, it told them how long they had before they must reach shelter. A lantern dimming on the road was a sign to quicken one's pace or to stop and make camp. The dwindling light was a warning, a reminder of the dangers of the open road and the importance of seeking safety. In cities, things were different. Gaslight eventually replaced candlelight in streets and businesses, casting a brighter, more consistent glow. But for centuries before, night watchmen carried long staffs with lanterns at their ends. These were lit as they began their patrol, and by the time the flame burned down, the shift was nearly over. Midnight was not rung by a bell, but by a fading glow on a cobbled street, a silent signal of the changing of the guard. Even in courts and government offices, time bent around. The flame. Debates ended not by gavel, but by the candle reaching its final inch. Legal records mention arguments paused at the candle's fall to be resumed the next morning. The legal day was measured by fire, the slow burn of the candle dictating the pace of justice. And in the theater, the audience sat in candlelight, not darkness. Chandeliers of wax hung above the stage, dripping occasionally onto viewers below, creating a shared experience of warmth and light. Performers were lit from below, faces golden, eyes glowing, their expressions enhanced by the flickering light. Scenes were not timed by acts, but by how long the candles would last, creating a sense of anticipation and suspense. Eventually, candles were replaced. Gaslight, then electricity, arrived, and with them came a different sense of time. A more rigid, mechanical one. Lights no longer fade, they snapped on or off, offering instant illumination at the flick of a switch. Time was no longer felt, it was read, displayed on clocks and watches with ever-increasing precision. But something was lost. In that shift, the awareness of an evening span, the choice to end the day when the candle burned low, the knowledge that the flame. Chapter 4. The Making of Light. In a time before the convenient flick of a switch, before the intricate web of wires, before the instant and silent illumination of LEDs, light was not a given, but a creation. It wasn't summoned from thin air, with a simple gesture, nor was it neatly stored, waiting in electrical sockets. Instead, it was painstakingly born, a product meticulously crafted by human hands, imbued with dedicated effort and unwavering care. A candle, that seemingly small, yet profoundly vital beacon illuminating the darkness of night, was far more than a mere object. It represented the culmination of countless hands, the investment of numerous hours, and a collection of delicate acts of skill and precision. To embark on the journey of candle making was to engage in a silent, almost mystical form of alchemy, the transformation of raw materials into a dancing flame, the conversion of precious time into a tangible source of brightness. This meticulous process was not only deeply practical, fulfilling a fundamental need for illumination, but also profoundly symbolic, representing the boundless ingenuity of humankind and the enduring, deeply ingrained desire to bring comfort, warmth, and a sense of security into the often unsettling embrace of darkness. The most highly prized and deeply cherished candles were undoubtedly those crafted from pure beeswax. Their scent was uniquely sweet, subtly floral, and remarkably clean, a fragrance that hinted at nature's bounty. They burned with a remarkably steady and consistent flame, casting a golden and soft light, filling the space with a warm and inviting glow while producing minimal smoke. However, these exceptional candles came at a considerable cost. Beeswax was a precious resource, painstakingly harvested from the carefully constructed hives of honeybees, a process undertaken only after the honey had been collected. This delicate task demanded patience, precision, and a keen understanding of the bees, and it was not without its inherent risks. Beekeepers, whether they were dedicated monks residing within the serene walls of a quiet cloister, or hard-working farmers tending to their land on a gentle, sun-kissed slope, diligently collected the valuable wax in specially designed frames. Or from traditional steps, the rounded, straw-woven hives commonly found throughout medieval Europe. Once the raw beeswax was successfully obtained, it underwent a thorough cleaning process. This was a slow, deliberate, and thoughtful undertaking, often taking place within the warm, fragrant confines of a monastery or a bustling village workshop. The raw wax was carefully broken down into manageable chunks and then gently melted over a low, controlled flame, often in large, sturdy cauldrons or humble stovetop kettles. As the wax gradually liquefied, impurities, small bits of leaves, the occasional unfortunate insect part, and tiny fragments of the hive itself would rise to the surface, forming a layer of unwanted scum. It was meticulously skimmed away with a ladle or a specialized skimmer. The now partially purified wax was then strained through coarse cloth or fine muslin to remove any remaining debris, ensuring a smooth and clean final product. Finally, the clarified wax was poured into carefully prepared molds, or simply left to cool in shallow pans, where it would gradually thicken and solidify into soft, yellow cakes that could be easily stored or further molded into smaller, more manageable blocks within the heart of bustling workshops or the cozy confines of busy kitchens. The beeswax was reheated as needed, its golden hue shimmering under the light. To create dipped candles, a wick typically spun from natural fibers such as flax, hemp, or fine linen was meticulously tied to a stick or a small dowel, often weighted with a small stone or a piece of lead shot to ensure it remained perfectly straight during the dipping process. The prepared wick was then carefully lowered into the pot of hot, molten wax, allowing the fibers to fully soak up the liquid. The wick was then slowly and deliberately withdrawn, allowing the wax to cool and solidify in the open air. This process was repeated again and again, sometimes dozens upon dozens of times, with each layer gradually building up the candle's length and defining its overall shape, transforming it into a miniature sculpture born of labor and unwavering patience. This gradual, deliberate process served as a unique form of meditation, a slow and calming ritual of transformation. As the simple wick slowly turned into a source of light, molded candles, conversely, offered a quicker path to production and boasted a greater degree of uniformity. Skilled artisans carefully poured liquid wax into meticulously crafted iron or tin molds, often shaped like elegant pillars, classic cones, or even intricate figurines, each mold carefully threaded with wicks that extended precisely through. The center. Once the wax had cooled and completely hardened, the mold was carefully removed, revealing a neat and polished candle, ready to illuminate the world. These molded candles were generally more expensive than their dipped counterparts, but they were greatly admired for their elegance, consistent shape, and overall regularity favored possessions of the wealthy, often used in grand homes and stately churches. Still, the traditional craft of dip making remained a cherished practice, particularly within humble cottages and serene monasteries, where simplicity, practicality, and the value of handcrafted items were deeply appreciated. However, not everyone had ready access to the prized beeswax, and for the vast majority of households, tallow served as the essential and readily available substitute. Tallow candles were crafted from rendered animal fat, typically sourced from sheep, cows, or pigs, making use of the byproducts of the butchering process. Following the slaughter of the animals, the fat was carefully collected and then slowly melted down in large pots or specialized tallow cauldrons, heated over open fires or slow-burning fires until it transformed into a liquefied, oily, and somewhat greasy substance. This rendering process filled the surrounding air with a distinctive and pungent, earthy smell and odor that some people found unpleasant, while others associated it with prosperity, resourcefulness, and the comforting knowledge of a well-stocked home. The hot fat was then poured through strainers or layers of cloth to remove any remaining bits of connective tissue, small pieces of meat, and other unwanted impurities, ensuring a cleaner and more consistent burn. Finally, the strained tallow was cooled and allowed to solidify into blocks or poured into molds for later use. The dipping process used to create tallow candles was remarkably similar to the one employed with beeswax, but the final product differed greatly in its characteristics. Tallow candles tended to produce significantly more smoke, often leaving behind a greasy film on walls and ceilings, a telltale sign of their presence. Their flames flickered unevenly, sometimes guttering or even extinguishing altogether in the presence of drafts. In the warmer months, they softened quickly, often drooping or melting away before their time, their structural integrity compromised by the heat. Conversely, in the depths of winter, they became brittle and more prone to cracking, their fragility amplified by the cold. Yet, despite these shortcomings, their relative affordability made them the light of everyday life candles that ordinary households could produce in large quantities without placing an undue strain on their limited resources. In many villages and on countless farms, candle making was far more than just a chore. It was a communal activity, a seasonal task that brought families together in a spirit of cooperation and shared purpose. The entire household might participate in the process, children helping to carefully prepare the wicks, mothers tending to the melting pots with watchful eyes, fathers skillfully dipping the candles or hauling supplies, and older relatives overseeing the entire operation, sharing their wisdom and experience. The sturdy racks or simple wooden frames where the finished candles were hung to cool resembled miniature forest rows of pale, slender fingers reaching upwards towards the ceiling, patiently waiting to be trimmed and carefully stored for future use. The distinctive smell of burning wax, whether it was the sweet fragrance of beeswax or the more earthy scent of tallow, permeated homes and workshops alike, mingling with a symphony of other familiar aromas: the comforting smell of bread baking in the oven, the pungent scent of herbs drying in the attic, the clean smell of soap curing in a corner. Every household developed its own unique candle making routine, and the role of candles extended far beyond mere illumination. They played a central part in marking special occasions: the flickering light of candles adorning a birthday cake, the solemn glow of candles illuminating a funeral service, the soft and comforting illumination during moments of quiet prayer. In grand cathedrals, great tapers and ornate candle holders adorned altars, their flames symbolizing divine presence, purity of spirit, and unwavering faith. At vespers and midnight masses, countless candles cast a warm, radiant glow that seemed to make the sacred space shimmer, creating an atmosphere of reverence and awe. The tradesmen who specialized in making candles, the chandlers, lived at the intersection of skilled craft and thriving commerce. Their shops were filled with shelves overflowing with various types of wax, meticulously crafted molds, carefully prepared wicks, and specialized tools: palm-sized pinches of metal, long tongs for handling hot wax, and sharp knives for trimming. The finished candles. Apprentices diligently learned the intricate art of melting, pouring, molding, and Chapter 5. When the lights went out, evening in the world before electric lights was not a matter of a simple action, a flick of a switch, a press of a button, or the subtle adjustment of a dimmer. Instead, the transition from day to night was a gradual, almost imperceptible shift, like the slow, quiet infiltration of dusk that seemed to seep into the very foundations, the very essence of a village. When the lights finally went out, it was not an abrupt cessation of brightness, a sudden plunge into darkness. Rather, it was a gentle, almost willing surrender to the inevitable, a quiet acceptance of the natural order. And within that surrender, within that embrace of the dark, people discovered a unique kind of tranquility, a peacefulness that we, in our constantly illuminated world, rarely afford ourselves the luxury of experiencing. Nightfall arrived with a soft, almost stealthy tread. Its presence felt more than seen. A single candle might continue to burn in the distant corner of a room, casting a warm, flickering glow, but even that small beacon was ultimately insufficient to completely hold the encroaching darkness at bay. Shadows began to gather and coalesce. In the corners of rooms, silent observers patiently waiting for their moment. Slowly, deliberately, these shadows stretched their tendrils toward the center of the space, gradually consuming the remaining light. Faces, once clearly defined, softened into indistinct silhouettes, their features blurred and indistinct. The final tasks of the day were performed slowly, deliberately, often in near silence, without the need for unnecessary speech. A final, careful stitch of sewing to mend a tear. The closing of a letter, the final words penned with care. The deliberate closing of shutters, a barrier against the creeping chill of the night air. There was a distinct ritual, a specific process associated with the act of extinguishing a light source. It was not a casual, thoughtless gesture, like simply flipping a switch to plunge a room into darkness. It was an act performed with intention, with deliberation, with a sense of reverence. A candle snuffer, a small, bell-shaped cone crafted from metal and affixed to the end of a slender handle, was carefully employed to gently smother the flame, depriving it of oxygen and preventing the release of acrid smoke into the air. The warm, inviting glow gradually faded, replaced by a growing coolness. The wick, starved of air, hissed faintly, a soft sigh as its light was extinguished. And then silence. Darkness settled in, a palpable presence that filled the room. Sometimes, in moments of haste, or perhaps amongst children playing, a candle was simply blown out. A quick puff of breath, a momentary rush of air, and the fragile flame danced once, in a final defiant flicker before being extinguished entirely. Children, captivated by the spectacle, would watch with wide-eyed fascination as the light vanished. The lingering scent of smoke, a faint but unmistakable odor, served as a constant reminder that light had only recently departed from the room. It was almost as if a ghostly impression of brightness remained, a fleeting memory of the light that had been. Households developed their own rhythms, their own patterns, for extinguishing the lights at the end of the day. A large, robust candle, positioned near the hearth, might be allowed to burn until all other sources of light had been extinguished, providing a central source of warmth and illumination. A smaller, more delicate taper, placed near the bed, would typically be the last to be extinguished, its light guiding those preparing for sleep. In some homes, only the main room, the heart of the dwelling, would be illuminated by candlelight after supper, while other rooms remained in darkness. In others, bedrooms were lit for just a brief period, long enough to allow the occupants to prepare for sleep, to say their prayers and settle beneath the covers. There was no expectation, no ingrained belief. That light must be omnipresent, that every corner of the home must be constantly illuminated. What activities occupied people? What did they do with their time after the lights had been extinguished and darkness had enveloped their homes? They lay in their beds, not necessarily asleep, at least not immediately, but quiet, still, reflective, lost in their own thoughts. This period was often referred to as first sleep, the initial, uninterrupted stretch of slumber that commenced shortly after darkness had settled over the land. In many cultures, it was a common practice to awaken from this first sleep a few hours later, to spend an hour or two in the quiet stillness of the night, engaging in various activities before drifting into a second sleep that lasted until dawn. During that period of midnight waking, people would often engage in quiet, introspective activities. They might offer prayers, seeking solace or guidance. They might tend a fire, adding fuel to the embers to ward off the chill. They might engage in soft, hushed conversations with a partner, sharing their thoughts and fears. Some might even write by the dim, flickering light of a smoldering candle, capturing their thoughts on paper before sleep claimed them once more. The silence that permeated the night was deeper, more profound than any daytime quiet. It wrapped itself around the house like a comforting woolen blanket, a tangible presence that muffled the sounds of the outside world. There was no constant hum of appliances, no incessant drone of traffic, no intrusive glow of street lamps to disrupt the tranquility. Just stillness, a profound and enveloping quiet. Candles provided a unique kind of companionship in those dark hours, their flickering flames offering a sense of comfort and security. A single flame positioned on the windowsill was often enough to soften the harshness of the dark, to hold back the perceived emptiness of the void. But eventually, even that small source of light would be allowed to go out, its purpose fulfilled. There was generally no sense of fear associated with this darkness. It was a familiar presence, an expected part of the natural cycle. The world, both indoors and out, was designed and built to accommodate it, to embrace it. Bedclothes were thick and warm, providing insulation against the cold. Walls were close and solid, offering a sense of security. Ceilings were low, creating a feeling of intimacy and enclosure. People had known and experienced true night since the moment of their birth. In rural areas, far from the light pollution of towns and cities, the darkness outside was immense, a vast and seemingly endless expanse. Only the moon and the stars, scattered across the inky sky, provided any form of illumination to the fields and forests. From the top of a hill, one could look across an entire valley and see only a handful of tiny dots of flickering yellow light, the faint glows emanating from other homes, representing other lives slowly winding down for the night. The land felt vast and expansive, yet also strangely calm and serene. There were no buzzing roads filled with traffic, no glaring headlights cutting through the darkness, just the quiet stillness of the night. If a candle was left burning through the night, it was always for a specific, practical purpose. Perhaps it was intended to light a hallway for someone who was expected home late, guiding their way through the darkness. Or perhaps it was kept burning to keep watch beside a sick bed, providing comfort and reassurance to the ailing. But otherwise, candles were carefully saved and conserved. Light was a precious commodity, something that had been painstakingly made by hand, carefully carried from place to place, and diligently protected from the elements. Letting it burn for no reason was not only considered wasteful, but also represented poor stewardship, a lack of respect for the resources available. In towns and cities, watchmen patrolled the streets on their nightly rounds, carrying lanterns to illuminate their path and deter crime. The rhythmic sound of their footsteps on the cobblestone streets was often the last noise heard before sleep claimed the inhabitants. Occasionally, a watchman's voice would call out the hour, a reassuring presence in the darkness. 2 o'clock, and all is well. The voice echoed faintly through the empty streets, then gradually disappeared into the silence. It was a comfort, a reminder that someone was watching over the town. The psychological shift that occurred with the loss of light was profound and significant. Our modern world is accustomed to constant stimulation, a relentless barrage of sensory input. Screens glow into the night, casting their artificial light. Rooms remain brightly lit even at midnight, defying the natural cycle of day and night. But in the candlelit world of the past, when the lights went out, so too did the mind's incessant chatter, the constant stream of thoughts and worries. This cessation of mental activity was not achieved through force or effort, but occurred naturally as a consequence of the environment. Light dictated activity. When it disappeared, so too did the perceived need to continue working, to continue striving. People stopped their activities not because they consciously chose to do so, but because there was simply no more light available to continue. In this forced cessation of activity, they found rest, a natural, unforced, and complete rest that permeated their bodies and minds. Dreams experienced under candleless sleep were often said to be deeper, more vivid, and closer to the soul. Without the distractions of ambient noise or artificial light, the brain was able to sink further into its natural rhythms, allowing for a more profound and restorative sleep, the kind of deep, uninterrupted sleep that we now attempt to achieve. Through the use of blackout curtains and white noise machines was once simply life, the natural state of being. Asterisk.